The signal came through the darkness of space like a cry in the night. Lieutenant Kyle Morrison was sitting at his station aboard the human warship Vengeance when the distress call appeared on his screen. The message was broken and filled with fear. He quickly cleaned up the transmission and called for his commander. Commander Lisa Hayes walked over to his station and listened to the message. A voice spoke through the bridge speakers in a language that their computer translated. It was from a ship called the Bright Wing, and they were under attack. The speaker said they had 12,000 people on board, including children. They were asking anyone who could hear them to please help. Their weapons were weak, and they could not fight back. Lisa felt her heart tighten. She had heard of the Varkesh before. They were known across the galaxy as brutal raiders who took what they wanted and killed anyone who got in their way. The ship calling for help belonged to the Kilari people, who were peaceful traders with no real military power. Lisa gave orders quickly. She told her crew to contact Earth Command and to plot a course to the coordinates where the Kilari ship was located. Her navigation officer, Brandon Cole, checked the numbers and said they could reach the ship in 18 hours if they pushed their engines hard. Lisa told him to make it 12 hours. She ordered all power to be redirected to the engines. Within an hour, the message had reached Earth. Admiral Richard Peterson stood in the command center looking at holographic displays that showed where all the human ships were positioned across space. He was a tall man with gray hair and a serious face. His intelligence officer, Captain Helen Cruz, told him that the Varkesh had 15 ships surrounding the helpless Kilari vessel. The Kilari had no chance of survival without help. Richard knew that humanity had been told to stay quiet since joining the galactic community 20 years ago. They were newcomers, and newcomers were supposed to avoid trouble. But Richard had not joined the military to watch innocent people die. He gave the order to activate Battle Group 7. He wanted 4 large warships to go to the Kilari coordinates immediately. Helen looked at him with surprise and said that Earth Command would have questions. Richard said they could ask questions after they saved those people. He said that humanity had been playing nice for 20 years, but maybe it was time the galaxy learned what happened when someone threatened people that humans were watching. The orders went out across human space. 4 massive warships began moving toward the distress signal. The ship called Retribution was the largest and carried powerful weapons. The ships called Warhammer and Thunderstrike were heavy cruisers designed for combat. The ship called Defiant carried 200 small fighter craft in its hangar bays. On the bridge of the Retribution, Captain Jack Romano received his orders with a tight smile. He told his crew to set course for the Kilari ship at battle speed. His second-in-command, Commander Nina Foster, pulled up information about Varkesh ships. She said that Varkesh shields were strong against energy weapons, but weak against solid projectiles. Their armor was standard metal plating. Jack nodded and said that meant human railguns would punch right through. He ordered all weapons to be prepared and told the crew to go to battle stations. Meanwhile, on the Kilari ship Bright Wing, things were getting worse. Captain Velnus watched as another blast of plasma fire hit his ship. Their shields were down to 30% and failing. His security officer told him the Varkesh would board them in minutes. Velnus looked at the faces of his crew and saw families and children. They were all counting on him to save them, but he had nothing to offer. He asked if anyone had responded to their distress call. His communications officer shook her head sadly and said no one had answered. They were alone. Velnus closed his eyes and prepared to tell his crew they would die with dignity. But suddenly, his communications officer shouted that she was receiving a transmission. It was encoded on a military frequency. It was from the humans. Every person on the bridge turned to look. The humans were known to the Kilari as strange creatures from a dangerous world called Earth. There were rumors about them, stories from the edges of space about human ships that moved incredibly fast and human soldiers who fought with terrifying skill. Velnus told his officer to play the message. A voice came through the speakers, speaking their language with an accent. It was Commander Lisa Hayes from the human ship Vengeance. She said they had received the distress call. She told them to hold on because help was coming. She said they were bringing friends, and they were bringing hell. For the first time in hours, Velnus felt hope instead of despair. He looked at his crew and saw the same hope reflected in their eyes. The Varkesh fleet commander, war leader Thrakis, stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the Kilari ship with satisfaction. The pathetic vessel was almost destroyed. Its shields were flickering and weak. Soon his soldiers would board the ship, and the real entertainment would begin. His communications officer told him the Kilari distress beacon was still broadcasting. Thrakis waved his clawed hand and said to let them cry into the void. No one interfered with Varkesh business. The Galactic Council were cowards, and the nearby sectors were under Varkesh control. His tactical officer said the Kilari ship had over 12,000 civilians, including children. Thrakis smiled and said that was excellent. Slavers would pay well for healthy workers, and the young ones could be trained. He ordered his boarding teams to prepare. The Varkesh were a reptilian species that was tall and heavily muscled with sharp teeth. Their culture was built on conquest. They had taken over a dozen star systems through pure brutality, and the Galactic Council had learned to look the other way. On the Bright Wing, Captain Velnus was doing everything possible to buy time. He ordered evasive maneuvers, even though their damaged engines made it difficult. He had the crew vent atmosphere from empty sections to create debris that might confuse Varkesh targeting. He even converted their industrial lasers into weapons, though they barely scratched the Varkesh shields. His first officer told him it would be 11 hours and 47 minutes until the humans arrived. Velnus looked at the tactical display showing the Varkesh ships closing in. Almost 12 hours might as well be forever, but it was all the hope they had. In human space, the battle group was pushing their ships to the absolute limit. Aboard the Retribution, the engineering crews worked frantically to keep the reactors from overheating as they redirected every bit of power to the engines. Chief Engineer Paul Martinez reported to Captain Jack Romano that they were running at 130% of recommended thrust. He said he could not promise they would not blow an engine coupling. Jack told him to keep the ship together, because those people did not have time for them to follow safety procedures. In the fighter bay of the ship, called Defiant, Lieutenant Danny Cooper was briefing his squadron. The pilots sat in rows, wearing black flight suits with their helmets resting on their laps. Their faces were young but determined. Danny told them they were going up against 15 Varkesh ships, including 3 heavy cruisers. Their job was to provide fighter cover for the fleet and to protect the Kilari transport. The Varkesh liked to use boarding pods, so the fighters would be on intercept duty. One of the younger pilots asked what the rules of engagement were. Danny's expression became hard. He said the Varkesh were attacking unarmed civilians, and there were children on that ship. The rules were simple. They would destroy every single Varkesh ship. No mercy and no quarter. The Varkesh wanted to prey on the weak, so they were about to learn what happened when the weak had friends from a death world. A fierce cheer erupted from the pilots. Humanity had been diplomatically careful since joining the galactic community 20 years ago. They were always mindful of their reputation as coming from a high-gravity, dangerous world. But that restraint had limits, and those limits ended at mass murder. On Earth, the news of the deployment had reached the president. President Andrew Clark sat in the Situation Room, surrounded by his advisors. Defense Secretary Kathleen Moore pointed out that Admiral Peterson had deployed a battle group without proper authorization. Technically, this was a violation of protocol. Andrew replied that, technically, they were about to save 12,000 innocent lives. He would worry about protocol violations later. What he wanted to know was what would happen after they saved the Kilari. Secretary of State Gregory Palmer said the Varkesh would protest. They would claim that humans violated their territory. Andrew asked if the Kilari had been in Varkesh space. Palmer said no. The Kilari were in neutral space about 50 light-years from the nearest Varkesh colony. Andrew leaned back in his chair and said then the Varkesh could take their protest and shove it. He ordered a message sent to the Galactic Council, informing them of human actions and reasoning. He wanted it made clear that humanity considered attacks on civilian vessels to be unacceptable regardless of who was conducting them. Palmer warned that this would make enemies. Andrew replied that they would deal with enemies, but they would deal with them as a species that did not abandon people in need. Back in space, the human fleet was now 7 hours from the Kilari position. On the bridge of the Vengeance commander, Lisa Hayes, was coordinating with the rest of the battle group. She told her crew that Admiral Peterson was sending the full cavalry. They had 4 capital ships, incoming, plus fighter wings. When they arrived, they were going to hit the Varkesh so hard that the raiders would think twice before attacking anyone again. Kyle asked what would happen if the Varkesh surrendered. Lisa's expression was cold. She said they would accept surrender and hold them for trial. But something told her the Varkesh were not the surrendering type. They were predators, and predators understood one thing, which was a bigger predator. Today, they were going to learn that humans protected the pack even if they had just met them. The hours passed slowly. Aboard the Bright Wing, the crew had managed to keep the Varkesh at bay through desperate maneuvering and creative thinking. They had even managed to destroy one of the smaller Varkesh ships when they lured it too close and detonated their cargo bay, which had been filled with explosive industrial chemicals. But they were on their last legs. Shields were down to 10%. Life support was failing in 3 sections. The Varkesh were preparing for a final assault. The sensors officer suddenly called out that he was detecting massive energy signatures entering the system. Multiple ships were coming, and they were moving very fast. Velnus felt his heart race and asked if they were human ships. The officer said yes. 5 signatures, including 4 large capital ships and 1 destroyer. They were broadcasting on all frequencies. The message played through the bridge speakers. A human voice filled the air deeper than Commander Hayes's voice, and carrying authority, and barely contained rage. It was Captain Jack Romano of the United Human Ship Retribution. He said the Varkesh were attacking a civilian vessel in neutral space. He ordered them to stand down immediately and withdraw, or the humans would engage with full force. The Varkesh had 5 minutes to comply. This was their only warning. On the Varkesh flagship called Crimson Fang, war leader Thrakis stared at his tactical display in disbelief. 5 human ships had just dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system, and they were accelerating toward his position at speeds that should have torn their ships apart. He demanded to know their fleet composition. His tactical officer reported 1 Dreadnought-class ship, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 carrier, and 1 destroyer. Their weapons were unlike anything in the Varkesh database. Their fighter wings were launching. The officer counted 200 small craft. Thrakis felt a chill run down his spine. The humans were newcomers, barely 2 decades in space. They should not have this kind of firepower. But as he watched the tactical display, he saw the truth. The humans were not bluffing. He ordered all ships to form defensive formation and prepare to engage. His communications officer asked uncertainly if they should not withdraw. The humans had superior numbers and firepower. Thrakis roared that they did not flee from mammals. They were Varkesh, and they would show these upstart Deathworlders what it meant to challenge them. He ordered all ships to open fire. In the void of space, the Varkesh fleet turned to face the approaching humans with their plasma cannons charging. They had superior numbers in total ships, and they had fought and won hundreds of battles across the sector, but they had never fought humans before. On the bridge of the Retribution, Captain Jack Romano watched the Varkesh fleet turn toward them, and he smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. He ordered all ships to battle stations and to launch all fighters. Weapons were free. He said they would show the Varkesh why you did not mess with Earth's neighbors. The human fleet surged forward, and the battle began. The first attack from the Varkesh fleet lit up the darkness of space with streams of superheated plasma. The bolts crossed the void at near-light speed with their targeting computers locked onto the approaching human vessels. It was a devastating attack with enough firepower to cripple most galactic warships. The plasma splashed against the human shields like water against stone. The tactical officer aboard the Retribution reported calmly that shields were at 92%, with minor fluctuations in the forward array that were already being compensated for. Captain Jack Romano barely glanced at the readings. He ordered all railguns to return fire with full spread. He said they would show the Varkesh what kinetic weaponry looked like. The Retribution's main batteries fired with a thunder that was felt rather than heard in the vacuum. Tungsten carbide slugs that each weighed several tons and were accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed, streaked across the space between the fleets. The Varkesh had never encountered weapons like these. Their shields were designed to dissipate energy weapons and did almost nothing against solid projectiles traveling at relativistic speeds. The first Varkesh cruiser took 3 direct hits. The slugs punched through its shields, then through its armor, and then through the ship itself, creating massive decompression as atmosphere vented into space. The cruiser listed to the side with fires erupting along its hull. Tactical reported the target was destroyed, and 2 more ships were heavily damaged. Jack told them good shooting and to continue firing. He ordered all ships to maintain formation and advance. He wanted those civilians protected. The ships called Warhammer and Thunderstrike added their firepower to the assault. The heavy cruisers were smaller than the Retribution, but no less deadly. Their railguns hammered the Varkesh line, while their missile batteries launched swarms of smart munitions that twisted and turned through space, evading point defense fire. War leader Thrakis watched in growing horror as his fleet was torn apart. He demanded to know what kind of weapons the humans were using and how they were penetrating Varkesh shields. His science officer stammered that the projectiles were solid matter and their shields could not stop them. The human missiles were using some kind of advanced guidance system that made their countermeasures ineffective. Thrakis ordered his ships to close the distance and launch all boarding pods. If they could not destroy the human ships, they would take them. It was a desperate move. But the Varkesh were nothing if not aggressive. Dozens of boarding pods launched from the Varkesh fleet. They were small, armored craft, designed to latch onto enemy hulls and deposit assault teams inside. It was a tactic that had worked for the Varkesh for centuries, but they had never faced human fighter pilots before. Lieutenant Danny Cooper led his squadron in a screaming dive toward the incoming pods. He called out orders, telling his pilots to break by pairs and take different flanks. He told them to light up the enemy. The human fighters were sleek, angular craft, built for speed and maneuverability. They carried plasma cannons and missile racks, and they were piloted by men and women who had trained in simulators based on centuries of atmospheric combat doctrine. The Varkesh pods did not stand a chance. Danny locked onto a pod with his targeting computer, painting it red. He called out his attack and squeezed the trigger. A missile leapt from his wing rail and covered the distance in seconds before detonating and turning the pod into expanding debris. All around him, his squadron was doing the same. The boarding pods that were designed to survive point defense fire from slower, less accurate weapons were being picked off like targets on a range. His wingman, Lieutenant Sarah Hayes, called out that this was too easy and the Varkesh were not even maneuvering. Danny told her to stay focused and reminded her that easy targets were still targets. He said not to let any through. Out of 200 launched pods, fewer than 20 made it past the fighter screen. Those that did found themselves facing the human ship's close-in weapon systems, which were automated rotary cannons that could track and destroy incoming threats with ruthless efficiency. The pods were shredded before they could latch on. Aboard the Bright Wing, Captain Velness and his crew watched the battle unfold with a mixture of awe and terror. The human fleet moved with a precision that seemed almost choreographed. Their weapons hit with devastating accuracy. Their fighters were everywhere at once, like a swarm of deadly insects protecting the hive. His first officer asked quietly if all human military engagements were like this. Velness admitted he did not know, but he was grateful the humans were on their side. The battle was rapidly turning into a massacre. The Varkesh fleet that had seemed so threatening just hours ago was being systematically destroyed. 3 of their cruisers were drifting hulks. 5 of their smaller ships had been reduced to debris. The rest were damaged and desperately trying to withdraw. On the bridge of the Crimson Fang, the tactical officer shouted that they must retreat. They had lost half their fleet. Thrakis stared at the tactical display with his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. The humans were supposed to be weak. They were newcomers. They had no business being this powerful. He growled that they would not flee. He ordered all remaining ships to concentrate fire on the human dreadnought. If they could destroy the flagship, perhaps the other ships would break. His communications officer said there was an incoming transmission from the humans. Thrakus told him to ignore it, but the officer said the humans were transmitting on all frequencies and it was being broadcast to every ship in the system. Thrakus snarled, but gestured for the communication to be played. Captain Jack Romano's voice filled the Varkesh bridge cold and unforgiving. He said this was the final warning for the Varkesh fleet. Their attack on a civilian vessel was an act of barbarism. They had one chance to surrender. They were to power down their weapons, drop their shields, and prepare to be boarded. If they continued to fight, the humans would destroy every single one of their ships. The Varkesh were to choose now. For a long moment, Thrakus said nothing. His claws dug into the armrests of his command chair. Then, with a roar of rage and humiliation, he gave the order. He told all ships to power down weapons and drop shields. They surrendered. The order spread through the Varkesh fleet like a wave of defeat. One by one, the ships went dark, with their weapons systems powering down and their shields collapsing. The survivors of the once proud raiding fleet sat dead in space, surrounded by the wreckage of their comrades and the victorious human warships. On the bridge of the Retribution, Jack Romano allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. He ordered teams to secure the prisoners and send boarding parties to the Varkesh ships to take their crews into custody. He asked for a damage report. Tactical reported minimal damage with a few scorch marks on the forward shields from the initial volley. That was it. Jack asked about casualties. The officer said there were none. Jack nodded again. The battle had lasted less than 40 minutes. He ordered a channel open to the Kilari ship. A moment later, Captain Velnus's face appeared on the screen. The Kilari looked exhausted but profoundly relieved. Jack told him warmly that his ship was secure and the Varkesh had surrendered. He said Velnus and his people were safe now. Velnus's large eyes glistened with what Jack recognized as tears. He said they could not thank the humans enough. The humans had saved all 12,000 lives. Jack replied that Velnus did not need to thank them. The Kilari had needed help, and the humans had answered. That was what neighbors did. He paused, then added that they would escort the Kilari to the nearest safe port and make sure their ship was repaired. He gave his word that no one would harm them again. The footage spread across the galactic network within hours. Ships passing through nearby systems had recorded the entire engagement, and what they saw shocked the civilized galaxy to its core. The humans, who were those cautious newcomers that had spent 20 years being diplomatically careful, had just destroyed a Varkesh raiding fleet in under an hour. On the Galactic Council station orbiting the neutral world of Parlax Prime, the emergency session was in chaos. Council Speaker Zendrix was a tall, willowy being from the ancient Lysarian species. He raised all 4 of his arms for silence and called for order. The council chamber was a massive, circular room with seats arranged in ascending tiers. Representatives from 47 species filled the space, and nearly all of them were talking at once. The holographic display in the center of the room showed the battle footage on repeat, with human ships moving at impossible speeds and weapons that ignored shields and fighters that danced through space. Ambassador Krenth of the Varkesh Dominion roared that the humans had violated every protocol. He was a massive specimen, even for his species, with ceremonial scars across his scaled face. He said the humans had attacked their fleet without provocation in neutral space, and this was an act of war. Ambassador Patricia Lawson replied calmly that the Varkesh fleet was attacking a civilian vessel. The human representative was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes. She had been humanity's voice on the council for 10 years. She said the Kilari transport was carrying 12,000 non-combatants, including children. The Varkesh forces were preparing to board them for enslavement. The humans had responded to a distress call, as was their right, under the Galactic Charter for the protection of refugees. Krenth shot back that the Kilari had crossed near Varkesh territory without permission and were subject to their enforcement laws. Patricia replied that they were in neutral space 50 light-years from the nearest Varkesh colony. The Varkesh had no jurisdiction there. Zendrix raised his arms again and said the facts were clear. The Varkesh attack was illegal under council law. However, the human response was also extreme. He said, the council must ask what else humanity was hiding. Their fleet had deployed weapons many species had never seen before, and their ships had survived a concentrated Varkesh assault with minimal damage. Patricia stood with her posture straight and confident. She said humanity had been transparent about their capabilities. Their ships used kinetic weapons because they developed them independently. Their shields were strong because Earth had a harsh radiation environment, and they built technology to protect themselves. Their tactics were effective because Earth had, unfortunately, a long history of warfare. They had never hidden these facts. Ambassador Theln of the Korvathi Federation pointed out that humanity had never displayed such force before. The Korvathi were an insectoid species known for their logical minds. He said in 20 years humanity had been peaceful and measured, and this suggested they had been deliberately concealing their true military strength. Patricia smiled thinly and said with respect there was a difference between concealing strength and choosing not to use it. Humanity had been peaceful because they believed in diplomacy first, but they would not stand by while innocents were slaughtered. The Varkesh chose to prey on the weak, and the humans showed them the consequences of that choice. The chamber erupted in debate again. Some species were terrified of humanity's display of power. Others were quietly pleased that someone had finally stood up to the Varkesh. Still others were calculating how they could use this situation to their advantage. In the back of the chamber, Ambassador Kilan of the Kilari Unity stood and spoke in a soft musical voice that nonetheless carried through the space. Zendrix nodded and gave him the floor. Kilan thanked the speaker and said he wished to make a statement on behalf of his people. His feathers ruffled with emotion. He said the crew of the Bright Wing consisted of his niece and her family, and his grand hatchlings were on that ship. When the Varkesh attacked, they sent out a distress call to everyone, to the council and to nearby systems and to anyone who might help. Only the humans answered. Only the humans came. They risked their ships and their people to save strangers they had never met. The Kilari owed them everything. Krenth sneered that the Kilari were grateful, but gratitude did not excuse the humans' excessive force. They could have negotiated. Kilan interrupted, which was a rare show of anger from the peaceful species. He said they could have done nothing like the rest of the galaxy. Where was the council fleet when they called for help? Where were their neighbors? The humans were 18 hours away, and they came at full speed. They saved 12,000 lives. If that was excessive force, then he prayed more species would learn to be excessive. The chamber fell silent. Kilan's words struck home to many who had been secretly ashamed of their own inaction. Zendrix sighed, a sound like wind through crystal. He said the council would take the matter under advisement. In the meantime, humanity was formally requested to provide a full accounting of their military capabilities to the council within 30 standard cycles. Patricia nodded and said they would comply with the council's request. But she made it clear that humanity would continue to respond to distress calls from civilian vessels, regardless of who was attacking them. They would not apologize for defending the defenseless. As the session broke up, Patricia was approached by several other ambassadors. Some offered quiet congratulations. Others wanted to open channels to discuss mutual defense agreements. The galaxy's power dynamics had just shifted, and everyone was scrambling to adjust. On Earth, President Andrew Clark watched the council session from the Situation Room. He asked his advisors how they thought it went. Secretary of State Gregory Palmer replied that it went better than expected. The Varkesh were isolated, and most of the council secretly wanted someone to bloody their nose. Humans just happened to be the ones willing to do it. Clark asked about the military assessment request. Admiral Richard Peterson smiled grimly and said they would give the council what they asked for, but they did not have to tell them everything. The council wanted to know about their ships and weapons, and that was fine. They did not need to know about classified projects or the new stealth destroyer class. Clark nodded and said they agreed. But they needed to be ready for what came next. The galaxy now knew humans could fight. Some would want them as allies. Others would see them as a threat. They needed to be ready for both. Meanwhile, aboard the Retribution captain, Jack Romano was dealing with more immediate concerns. His ships had escorted the Kilari transport to Parlak Station, where repairs were underway. But he had also taken on board several hundred Varkesh prisoners, and that presented its own challenges. Commander Nina Foster reported that the Varkesh prisoners were requesting to speak with him. Jack asked dryly if they wanted to lodge a complaint about their accommodations. Nina said, not exactly, and their senior surviving officer said he had information he wanted to trade. Jack told her to bring him to the ready room. 10 minutes later, Jack sat across a desk from a Varkesh officer who introduced himself as Sub-Leader Varkon. The Varkesh was younger than Thrakis had been, with fewer scars and sharper eyes. Part 5. Varkon began by saying he wished to offer information in exchange for lenient treatment of his crew. Jack said he was listening. Varkon explained that the attack on the Kilari ship was not random. They were hired. Jack leaned forward and asked by whom. Varkon said he did not have a name, only a contact. But they were interested specifically in the Kilari. They wanted prisoners, especially the young ones. They were willing to pay a significant sum for live captures. Jack felt a cold anger settle in his gut. He asked if someone had hired them to kidnap Kilari children. Varkon said yes, and it was not just them. There had been other attacks on Kilari vessels in recent months. Small raids always blamed on pirates or accidents. But they were coordinated. Jack asked if he had proof of this. Varkon produced a data chip and said it contained communication logs and payment records and everything else. He kept copies in case he needed leverage. Jack asked why Varkon was telling him this. The Varkesh officer looked Jack in the eyes and said it was because war leader Thrakis was a fool who got them all killed or captured. He had seen what humans could do when they were angry. And whoever hired them to attack the Kilari did not care if they lived or died. He would rather take his chances with the humans than with them. Jack took the data chip and said if this information checked out, he would make sure it was considered at trial. But Varkon had to understand he was still responsible for his actions. He had attacked innocent people. Varkon said he understood. Jack stood and dismissed the Varkesh. As Varkon was escorted back to the brig, Jack reviewed the data chip. What he found there made him reach for the secure communication system immediately. He ordered a Priority 1 connection to Admiral Peterson, because they had a bigger problem than they thought. 3 weeks after the Battle of Bright Wing, Admiral Richard Peterson stood before a joint session of the Galactic Council's Defense Committee. The room was smaller than the main council chamber, but no less impressive, with holographic displays showing star charts and fleet positions across known space. Peterson was flanked by Ambassador Patricia Lawson and Captain Jack Romano. Between them, they had spent the past weeks analyzing the data provided by Sub-Leader Varkon and conducting their own investigation. What they had discovered was disturbing. Peterson began by saying that what they initially believed to be a simple pirate attack on the Kilari vessel was in fact part of a much larger criminal operation. Over the past 18 months, there had been 23 attacks on Kilari ships and settlements. The attacks were carried out by different groups, including the Varkesh and mercenaries and unidentified raiders, but all of them were coordinated by a single organization. Jack activated the holographic display, and images appeared showing money transfers and communication intercepts and ship movements. He explained that they believed this organization was running a trafficking operation targeting the Kilari specifically. Their goal appeared to be the capture of Kilari young for an unknown purpose. They had traced the money back through several shell corporations, but the trail went cold at a financial institution on Kelthara Prime. Ambassador Theln of the Korvathi leaned forward and said Kelthara Prime was a major financial hub, and many organizations used their banks for legitimate business. Patricia agreed, and said that was why they were bringing this to the council rather than taking unilateral action. This investigation required cooperation across multiple jurisdictions. Zendrix acknowledged this was a council matter. If there truly was an organized trafficking ring, they would investigate. But he had to ask why humanity was taking such an interest. The Kilari were not part of their alliance or trade sphere. Peterson met the speaker's gaze steadily. He said it was because it was the right thing to do. When they saw innocent people being targeted, they did not ask what was in it for them. They asked what they could do to help. That was what they believed in. The committee members exchanged glances. Some seemed moved by Peterson's words. Others remained skeptical. Zendrix said, after a long pause, that the Council would authorize an investigation. However, given humanity's demonstrated capabilities, they requested that human forces participate in the operation. He called it a test of human council cooperation. Peterson nodded and said they accepted, but they had conditions. First, any rescue operations would prioritize the safety of civilians. Second, anyone captured would face trial under council law, not summary execution. And third, they wanted full transparency, with no classified information that could hide corruption. Zendrix nodded and said this was acceptable. They would form a joint task force. Peterson would command the human contingent, and Captain Romano's ship would serve as the task force flagship. Over the next 6 weeks, the joint task force quietly gathered evidence. The investigation revealed something that shocked even the cynical council members. The trafficking operation was being run by elements within the Varkesh Dominion's own government, along with corrupt officials from 3 other species. They had been capturing Kilari young and selling them to wealthy collectors who prized them as exotic servants. The revelation caused a political earthquake. The Varkesh government, facing evidence of high-level corruption, arrested dozens of officials. Ambassador Krenth himself was implicated and forced to resign in disgrace. Other species involved faced similar purges, but the criminals had resources and were not going down without a fight. When the task force moved to arrest the ringleaders, they found themselves facing a private fleet of mercenary ships defending a hidden facility in the Corvin Nebula. The Retribution led the joint task force into the nebula, accompanied by ships from the Kilari and the Korvathi, and even a Varkesh vessel whose captain wanted to redeem his species' honor. The battle was brief, but intense. The mercenaries fought with desperation, but they were no match for the combined firepower of the task force. Inside the facility, the rescue teams found over 300 Kilari young being held in cramped cells. Among the rescuers was Lieutenant Kyle Morrison, from the Vengeance, who had volunteered for the ground assault team. He reported over the comm as his team secured the last cell block that they had found them. They were scared but alive, and medical teams were on the way. As the rescued Kilari were transferred to the ships, Kyle watched a young Kilari no more than 6 or 7 in human years clutching a stuffed toy and looking up at him with wide, frightened eyes. Kyle knelt down to the child's level and said gently that it was okay and they were safe now. They were taking them home. The child did not speak, but after a moment, she reached out and took Kyle's hand. It was such a simple gesture, but it reminded him exactly why they had fought so hard. Back on Earth, President Andrew Clark addressed the nation with the speech being broadcast across human space and to the wider galaxy. He said 3 months ago they received a distress call from people they had never met from a species they barely knew. They could have ignored it. They could have decided it was not their problem. But that was not who they were. Humanity had always believed that with power came responsibility. That if you could help, you should help. That the strong had a duty to protect the weak. He paused and looked directly into the camera. Today, he could announce that the trafficking operation targeting the Kilari people had been shut down. Over 300 children had been rescued and returned to their families. The criminals responsible were in custody and would face justice. This operation succeeded because species across the galaxy worked together, putting aside differences to fight a common evil. Some had asked whether humanity was ready to be a major power in galactic affairs, and whether they could be trusted with the military capabilities they possessed. Their actions spoke for themselves. They did not seek conflict. They did not want to dominate others. But they would not stand by while atrocities were committed. They would not ignore cries for help, and they would not apologize for defending those who could not defend themselves.